The courthouse stood tall against the dim gray sky, its steps crowded with contestants clutching portfolios and laptops. Among them was Ethan Carter, a lanky 17-year-old with an intense gaze and a worn leather satchel slung across his shoulder. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the mix of nerves and determination swirling inside him. Ethan had spent weeks preparing for this youth contest, a unique opportunity to propose ideas for reforming the justice system. He knew the stakes. This was more than a competition. For Ethan, it was a chance to confront the inequalities that had haunted his community and to prove that voices like his mattered. As he climbed the courthouse steps, Ethan's mind replayed his mother's words from the night before. "Speak your truth, Ethan. Even if they don't want to hear it, make them listen." Her voice was steady, but he'd seen the worry in her eyes. His neighborhood wasn't the kind of place people associated with success stories. Yet here he was, standing on the threshold of change, carrying not just a proposal, but the hopes of everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked. Inside, the air was crisp with authority. The marble floors echoed with purposeful footsteps, and the walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced judges. Ethan couldn't help but feel out of place, his jeans and sneakers a stark contrast to the polished shoes and tailored suits around him. He gripped the strap of his satchel tighter, feeling the weight of his neatly typed proposal inside a proposal he had spent countless late nights perfecting. "Excuse me, young man," a security guard's voice broke through his thoughts. "Can I see your identification?" Ethan quickly fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the crumpled contest invitation. The guard gave it a cursory glance before nodding. "Room 205, second floor." "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. As he walked toward the stairs, he passed a group of contestants chatting animatedly. They exuded confidence, their polished presentations and practiced smiles making Ethan feel like an outsider. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on his mother's voice in his head. Make them listen. When he entered room 205, the atmosphere was both intimidating and exhilarating. The space buzzed with energy, the air thick with anticipation. A judge's table dominated the front of the room, flanked by rows of chairs for the participants. Ethan scanned the room, his heart sinking slightly as he caught sight of Judge Robert Hawthorne, a man whose reputation preceded him. Known for his unyielding demeanor and sharp tongue, Judge Hawthorne had a way of making even seasoned lawyers squirm. Ethan swallowed hard, determined not to let the judge's presence rattle him. Taking a seat in the back row, Ethan pulled out his proposal and began reviewing it one last time. The words on the page felt heavy with meaning, each sentence carefully crafted to address the systemic inequalities he had witnessed firsthand. His proposal wasn't just theoretical. It was rooted in the stories of people he knew, friends and family, who had been caught in a system that often seemed stacked against them. The room grew quiet as Judge Hawthorne stood to address the contestants. His voice was deep and authoritative, commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to hear your visions for a better justice system. Remember, this is not a game. This is your opportunity to present ideas that could shape the future. I expect clarity, substance, and respect." Ethan's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He glanced at the clock on the wall, counting down the minutes until his name would be called. Yet, beneath his nerves, a quiet resolve began to take root. He wasn't here to impress the judge or win a trophy. He was here to speak for those who couldn't. And no matter what happened, he would make them listen. As the first contestant took the stage, Ethan leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a small, determined smile. "They don't know it yet," he thought, "but I have something to say that they won't forget." Ethan Carter sat stiffly in the back row of room 205, clutching his proposal like a lifeline. The first few presentations had been a whirlwind of polished arguments and impressive slideshows, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He kept stealing glances at Judge Robert Hawthorne, whose stern expression seemed etched in stone. With his gray hair neatly combed and a pair of glasses perched on his sharp nose, Hawthorne exuded an air of authority that demanded obedience. Ethan had heard the stories. Hawthorne wasn't just a tough judge. He was infamous for his disdain for anything that hinted at mediocrity. Contestants often whispered about how one raised eyebrow from him could unravel even the most confident speaker. Still, Ethan reminded himself of his purpose. This isn't about me. It's about the message. As the next presenter walked off the stage, Judge Hawthorne glanced at his clipboard. His voice rang out, firm and unyielding. Next participant, Ethan Carter. Ethan stood, his legs feeling like lead, and started walking toward the podium. His palms were damp, but he wiped them discreetly on his jeans. Before he could reach the front, Hawthorne raised a hand, halting him mid-step. "You there," Hawthorne said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Do you have the correct paperwork?" Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He held up his proposal. "Yes, sir. I have it right here." Hawthorne squinted at him, his expression unreadable. "And you're here as a participant?" "For this competition, yes, sir," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. A flicker of something doubt, perhaps disdain, crossed Hawthorne's face. "I find that hard to believe," the judge said curtly. "You're clearly not dressed for the occasion, and I don't recall seeing your name during the earlier review." The room fell silent, the weight of Hawthorne's words pressing down on Ethan like a physical force. Ethan could feel the stares of the other participants, a mix of confusion and pity. His cheeks burned with humiliation, but he refused to look away from the judge. "I can assure you, sir, I was invited," Ethan said firmly, holding out the crumpled invitation he had shown the security guard earlier. "I spent weeks preparing for this." Hawthorne didn't even glance at the paper. Instead, he turned to a nearby bailiff. "Escort this young man out. He clearly does not belong here." The words hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, the bailiff placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Wait," Ethan said, his voice rising. "I have every right to be here. This proposal," he held up the neatly bound pages as if they were a shield. "It's about fixing the system, about giving people like me a chance to be heard. Isn't that the whole point of this contest?" For a brief moment, something flickered in Hawthorne's eyes, but it vanished just as quickly. "The point of this contest," he said coldly, "is to identify serious candidates who can contribute meaningful ideas, not to entertain unprepared individuals wasting our time." Ethan's heart pounded as the bailiff gently but firmly guided him toward the exit. He glanced around the room, hoping for someone to speak up on his behalf, but the other participants avoided his gaze. The humiliation was suffocating, but Ethan bit back his frustration. He refused to let them see him break. As he reached the door, Ethan turned back one last time. "You're wrong about me," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "You might not see it now, but I have something to say. And I'll find a way to make you listen." The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Ethan stood there for a moment, his breathing shallow and uneven. The sting of Hawthorne's dismissal was sharp, but it also ignited a fire deep within him. This wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the beginning. The chill in the courthouse air still lingered on Ethan Carter's skin as he stood outside, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The humiliation of being escorted out in front of everyone burned deep, but so did the sting of Judge Hawthorne's words. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, but it offered little comfort. He clenched his fists, the crumpled contest invitation still pressed between his fingers. Around him, bystanders paused, their curiosity piqued by the young man who had clearly been thrown out of the courthouse. A few murmurs rippled through the small crowd, but Ethan was too focused on steadying himself to notice. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, a soothing reminder, even when the world tries to silence you, Ethan, don't let it. Your truth matters. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Hey, are you okay? A woman in her late 20s, dressed in business casual attire, stepped forward. She had warm brown eyes and a phone in her hand, already angled slightly toward him as if to record. Ethan hesitated, his pride warring with his need to speak up. Finally, he nodded. I'm fine, he said, though his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his emotions. I wasn't even given a chance to explain myself in there. The woman frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. What happened? Did they kick you out of the contest? Ethan looked around, noticing the growing attention from onlookers. He felt exposed, but also aware of an opportunity. Swallowing his hesitation, he straightened his shoulders. They didn't even let me present, he said, his voice growing steadier. Judge Hawthorne dismissed me before I could say a word. He assumed I didn't belong because I don't fit his idea of what someone who can make a difference looks like. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the small crowd. The woman with the phone raised it higher, her expression determined. You're saying they didn't even let you try? That's not right. Ethan shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. It's more than just unfair. This competition was supposed to be about ideas, about fixing what's broken in the justice system. But instead, they silenced me just like the system does to so many others. The conviction in his words seemed to stir something in the people around him. A middle-aged man wearing a construction vest crossed his arms, nodding slowly. A teenager on a skateboard stopped, pulling out his phone to record. Even the woman with the phone began live streaming, her fingers flying across the screen as she typed a caption. Teen denied chance to speak at Justice Reform Contest. Here's his story. Ethan glanced at her, feeling a sudden pang of vulnerability. What are you doing? He asked. Sharing this, she said firmly. People need to see what's happening. If they won't listen to you in there, maybe they'll listen out here. Ethan hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed in the power of words, but he hadn't expected them to take on a life of their own so quickly. Taking a deep breath, he turned to face the small crowd that had gathered. If this was his platform, he was going to use it. Listen, he began, his voice carrying a blend of frustration and hope. I didn't come here today to cause a scene. I came because I believe the justice system can be better, fairer, more transparent, and more humane. I've seen what it looks like when the system fails people. I've lived it, and I wanted to share a proposal to make it better. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. But they didn't even give me a chance. Judge Hawthorne took one look at me and decided I didn't belong. That's the problem. The system decides who matters and who doesn't before they even have a chance to speak. The crowd had grown silent, their attention fixed on him. Some nodded in agreement, others recorded on their phones. Ethan's heart raced, but he pressed on. This isn't just about me, he continued. It's about everyone who's been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced. I might not have gotten to speak in there, but I'll keep fighting to be heard out here. Because change doesn't happen by staying silent." As he finished, a ripple of applause broke out among the onlookers. The sound startled Ethan, but it also sent a surge of warmth through him. For the first time since entering the courthouse that morning, he felt seen not by Judge Hawthorne, but by the people who mattered most, the ones who understood his struggle and shared his vision for change. The woman with the phone lowered it, a small smile playing on her lips. "That was powerful," she said. "What's your name? People are going to want to know who you are." "Ethan Carter," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "And I'm not giving up." The video of Ethan Carter's impassioned speech spread like wildfire. By the time he returned home that evening, it had already been shared thousands of times. Ethan sat in the small kitchen of his family's modest home, his laptop open on the table, and stared in disbelief at the notifications flooding his phone. The hashtags #LetEthanSpeak and #JusticeForAll were trending. Strangers from all walks of life were commenting, sharing their own stories of being silenced or dismissed and offering words of encouragement. His mother, Maria Carter, stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "I told you your voice mattered," she said, her tone filled with pride and warmth. But Ethan could hear the underlying worry as well. The internet's attention was unpredictable, and with support often came criticism. Maria pulled a chair next to him and sat down. Her eyes scanned the screen, catching messages of solidarity mixed with a few scathing remarks. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice steady, "not everyone will agree with you. Some people might even try to tear you down. But you can't let that stop you. You've already done something incredible. Look at all these people who are standing with you." Ethan nodded, though the weight of the day still pressed heavily on his chest. "I just didn't expect it to get this big so fast," he admitted. "I mean, I knew the system was broken, but I didn't think anyone would care about what I had to say." Maria tilted her head, her expression firm yet kind. "People care, Ethan. They just need someone brave enough to say what they're too afraid to. And today, you were that someone." Before he could respond, the doorbell rang. Ethan exchanged a confused glance with his mother. It was late, and they weren't expecting visitors. Maria walked cautiously to the door, peeking through the small window before opening it. Standing there was Mrs. Jackson, the neighborhood's longtime community organizer. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 60s, with graying curls and an ever-present air of determination. "Maria," Mrs. Jackson greeted, her voice brisk but warm. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I had to come by." Maria smiled, stepping aside to let her in. "Not at all, Mrs. Jackson. Please come in." The older woman stepped into the kitchen, her gaze landing on Ethan. "You," she said, pointing a finger at him. "You made some waves today, young man." Ethan straightened in his chair, unsure whether her tone was approving or critical. I didn't mean to cause trouble," he stammered. Mrs. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Trouble? Ethan, what you caused was a spark. And sparks, when handled right, can light fires. Fires that bring change." Her words settled over the room like a challenge. Ethan looked at her, the weight of her statement both thrilling and intimidating. "I just wanted to speak my truth," he said finally. "I didn't think it would reach so many people." "That's the beauty of truth," Mrs. Jackson replied. "It resonates whether you mean it to or not." She pulled out a chair and sat down across from Ethan. "Now listen. This is just the beginning. The people who are rallying behind you need to see that you're not backing down. That video, your words, they've already inspired so many. But it's not enough to just speak out. You need to follow through. Ethan swallowed hard, the enormity of the situation settling in. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. You start by leaning on the people who believe in you, Mrs. Jackson said firmly. Your family, your friends, your community. And you use this momentum to keep pushing for what's right. Maria chimed in, her voice filled with quiet determination. She's right, Ethan. You don't have to do this alone. We're here for you, and so are so many others. As if to prove her point, Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from James Rivera, a local high school teacher who had been one of Ethan's biggest supporters. The message read, "Saw the video. Proud of you. Let's meet tomorrow to talk about how we can turn this into something bigger." Ethan read the message aloud, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. Mrs. Jackson nodded approvingly. "There you go," she said. "People are ready to stand with you. Now, the question is, are you ready to lead?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan looked at his mother, then at Mrs. Jackson, and finally back at the screen, where messages of support continued to pour in. He thought about the people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced, just like he had been earlier that day. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Whatever it takes, I'm not backing down." Maria smiled, her eyes brimming with tears of pride. Mrs. Jackson nodded, a rare smile softening her usually serious expression. "Good," she said. "Because change doesn't come easy. But with enough voices, it comes." As the night wore on, the house buzzed with energy. Calls came in from neighbors, activists, and friends, all offering their support. The hum of determination filled the air, weaving a tapestry of hope and resolve that would carry Ethan forward into the next chapter of his journey. The morning after Ethan Carter's viral speech, the courthouse felt strangely tense. Judge Robert Hawthorne arrived early, his usual composed demeanor betrayed by the tightness of his jaw. As he walked through the hallways, staff exchanged uneasy glances. The video had reached them too, spreading across local news channels and social media like wildfire. Hawthorne's name was trending for all the wrong reasons, and it was clear the public was paying attention. Inside his chambers, Hawthorne closed the door behind him and sat heavily at his desk. The thick oak surface was littered with case files, but his attention was fixed on the tablet in front of him. He had made the mistake of watching the video twice. Ethan's words echoed in his mind. The system decides who matters and who doesn't before they even have a chance to speak. The judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. He had spent decades earning his reputation as a no-nonsense authority figure, someone who upheld the law with unwavering conviction. But now, that very reputation was under siege. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice sharp. The door opened to reveal Cynthia Porter, the courthouse's media liaison. Dressed in a navy blazer and armed with a clipboard, she stepped in cautiously, her usual confident stride subdued. "Judge Hawthorne," Cynthia began, her tone carefully measured. "We need to discuss the fallout from yesterday's incident." "I'm well aware of the situation, Miss Porter," Hawthorne replied curtly. "What's the damage?" Cynthia hesitated, glancing at her clipboard. "The video has over 2 million views," she said. "Local news stations have picked it up, and several community leaders are calling for a formal apology. There's talk of a protest outside the courthouse later this week." Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "A protest? Over a misguided teenager who doesn't understand how the system works?" Cynthia raised an eyebrow, clearly holding back her own opinion. "Misguided or not, Judge," his words resonated with people. The public perception is that he was dismissed unfairly, and that reflects on this courthouse. The judge waved a hand dismissively. This will blow over. It always does. People have short attention spans. Cynthia's expression remained neutral, but her silence spoke volumes. After a moment, she said, "With respect, Judge, this feels different. Social media amplifies these issues in ways we've never dealt with before. And Ethan Carter isn't just some kid. He's articulate, passionate, and relatable. That makes him a symbol of what people think is wrong with the system." Hawthorne frowned, the weight of her words settling over him. "And what do you suggest I do? Apologize publicly? Admit fault?" Cynthia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think it's worth considering how this situation is being perceived, both by the public and within the courthouse. It's not just about you, it's about the institution. If you double down, it could do lasting damage to your reputation and the court's credibility." The judge leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Do you honestly think I care about public opinion, Miss Porter? My job is to uphold the law, not cater to the whims of the internet." Cynthia met his gaze, unflinching. "Your job is also to ensure that justice is seen as fair and accessible. Dismissing Ethan Carter without hearing him undermined that perception. Like it or not, this is a crisis, and how you handle it will define how people remember you." Hawthorne said nothing, his mind racing. He had spent his career believing that justice was about order, discipline, and authority. But now, his methods were being questioned by a generation that valued transparency and equity above all else. It wasn't just frustrating, it was deeply unsettling. As Cynthia left the chambers, Hawthorne sat in silence, the walls of his office feeling unusually confining. He turned back to the tablet, rewatching the video one more time. Ethan's words struck a nerve, not because they were wrong, but because they held a kernel of truth he wasn't ready to admit. Across town, newsrooms buzzed with activity. The fallout from Ethan's speech was dominating headlines, and city officials were beginning to take notice. In a televised segment that morning, Councilwoman Angela Harris, known for her advocacy of judicial reform, addressed the issue directly. "It's not just about one judge or one young man," she said. "This is about a system that has failed too many for too long. Ethan Carter's experience shines a light on the broader issues we must address. Dismissing someone without listening to their ideas is not just unfair, it's emblematic of the barriers many people face when trying to advocate for change." Her words sent ripples through the community. Protests were organized, petitions circulated, and conversations about justice reform intensified. For many, Ethan Carter had become a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that even those without power could challenge the status quo. Back in his chambers, Hawthorne couldn't escape the growing noise. For the first time in years, doubt began to creep into his mind. He prided himself on being firm but fair. Yet, the mirror Ethan had held up to the system and to him was difficult to ignore. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in Ethan Carter's small bedroom, casting stripes of light across his desk. The room was a mix of organized chaos, papers, notebooks, and printed articles scattered about, all centered on one goal: reform. Despite the whirlwind of the last few days, Ethan was determined to present his proposal at the courthouse, even if it meant walking into the lion's den once more. Downstairs, his mother, Maria, was waiting, holding a cup of tea. Her expression was a blend of pride and concern as Ethan entered the kitchen, dressed neatly in a button-down shirt and slacks, his version of formal attire. "You ready for this?" Maria asked, her voice soft but steady. She slid the tea across the counter toward him. Ethan nodded, though his heart felt like it was racing a marathon. As ready as I'll ever be. They might try to ignore me again, but I'm not giving them that chance. Maria smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You've already made us proud, Ethan. Just remember why you're doing this. Ethan's gaze hardened with resolve. For the people who don't get a second chance. For the ones who never even got a first. When Ethan arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was different. A group of supporters stood gathered near the entrance, holding signs that read slogans like "Justice for All" and "Let Ethan Speak." Some waved as he approached, their voices ringing out in encouragement. "Ethan, you've got this. We believe in you." The support filled him with equal parts courage and pressure. His steps were steady as he walked through the glass doors and into the now familiar marble halls. Today, there was no confusion, no one asking for his identification. Instead, the staff avoided his eyes, murmuring softly as he passed. When he entered room 205, the tension was palpable. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Judge Robert Hawthorne sat at the bench, his posture as rigid as ever. His piercing gaze followed Ethan as he crossed the room, taking a seat near the front. As the other contestants presented, Ethan could feel the weight of Hawthorne's scrutiny. Each speaker was polished, their arguments well constructed, but their words seemed to float through the air without landing. Ethan knew his proposal wasn't just words, it was a lifeline, drawn from real experiences and the pain of a community that had been ignored for far too long. Finally, his name was called. Ethan Carter, Judge Hawthorne announced, his tone clipped. There was no mistaking the slight edge in his voice, as if he were daring Ethan to falter. Ethan stood, clutching his proposal tightly, and made his way to the podium. The room seemed to shrink around him, the silence deafening. He took a deep breath, steadying his hands as he placed the pages before him. "Thank you for this opportunity," Ethan began, his voice steady, but charged with emotion. "Before I present my proposal, I want to acknowledge something. A few days ago, I was dismissed before I had a chance to speak. That moment wasn't just about me. It was about a system that often silences those who need to be heard the most." A murmur rippled through the room, but Ethan didn't waver. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "My proposal isn't just about ideas. It's about people like my best friend Marcus, who was arrested at 16 for a minor mistake and lost opportunities he'll never get back. People like my uncle, who couldn't afford bail and spent months in jail for something he didn't even do. These are the faces behind the statistics we talk about when we discuss justice reform." Judge Hawthorne's expression remained inscrutable, but Ethan caught a flicker of something curiosity. Doubt in his eyes. It gave him the courage to press on. "My plan focuses on 3 key areas: equity, transparency, and accountability. First, we need community liaisons in every courthouse, people who can help bridge the gap between the legal system and the people it serves. Second, we must increase transparency by making legal processes clearer and more accessible to everyone, regardless of their background. And finally, accountability. We need checks and balances to ensure that no judge, no officer, no prosecutor is above the law." The room was silent, every word hanging in the air. Ethan's voice softened as he reached the heart of his argument. "I'm not here because I think I can fix everything overnight. I'm here because I believe in the possibility of change. And I believe that change starts when we truly listen to those who have been ignored." A moment of stillness followed as Ethan finished. Then, unexpectedly, a slow clap began. It started with one of the other contestants, then spread through the audience until the room was filled with applause. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving, overwhelmed by the response. Judge Hawthorne raised a hand, silencing the crowd. His expression was unreadable as he leaned forward, addressing Ethan directly. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice deliberate, "your proposal is thought-provoking. We'll deliberate and announce the results at the closing ceremony." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he returned to his seat, a sense of relief washed over him. He had spoken his truth, and for the first time, he felt like the room had truly listened. The grand hall of the courthouse was packed to capacity, its usual sterile atmosphere replaced by an electric buzz of anticipation. Contestants, judges, and members of the community filled the rows of chairs, their murmurs blending into a low hum of excitement. The culmination of the justice reform contest had arrived, and everyone was eager to hear the final decision. Ethan Carter sat near the back, his hands clasped tightly together. His mother, Maria, sat beside him, her presence a calming anchor in the sea of his nerves. The last few days had been a whirlwind, supporters flooding his social media, interviews with local news outlets, and countless messages of encouragement from strangers who had seen the video of his speech. Yet, despite the outpouring of support, Ethan couldn't shake the weight of uncertainty. At the front of the room, a podium stood beneath a large banner that read, "Youth Justice Reform Initiative, Shaping Tomorrow's Leaders." Behind it sat the panel of judges, including the ever-intimidating Judge Robert Hawthorne, whose expression remained as unreadable as it had been during Ethan's presentation. The ceremony began with the usual formalities, a recap of the contest's purpose, acknowledgments of the participants, and polite applause. But the room grew noticeably quieter when Angela Harris, a respected councilwoman and outspoken advocate for reform, stepped up to the podium. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Today is more than just a competition. It's a celebration of ideas, of courage, and of the belief that change begins when we dare to imagine something better. Every participant here has demonstrated a commitment to justice, and for that, we are deeply grateful." Her words were met with a wave of applause, but Ethan barely heard it. His heart pounded as she continued. "Over the past week, this contest has sparked conversations far beyond this courthouse. It has reminded us all that justice is not just a concept, it's a lived experience. And today, we honor one individual whose vision has already begun to inspire real change." Ethan's breath caught. He told himself not to hope too much, not to let his mind race ahead of the moment. Yet, as Councilwoman Harris's eyes scanned the room, a small part of him couldn't help but believe she was looking right at him. "This year's winner," she announced, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the entire hall, "is someone who turned adversity into a platform, who refused to let his voice be silenced. It is my honor to announce that Ethan Carter will not only receive this year's award, but will also serve as the courthouse's new Youth Justice Reform Director." For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. Ethan stared at her, uncomprehending, as the words sank in. The silence broke with a thunderous applause, cheers echoing off the marble walls. Maria grabbed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "you did it." Ethan stood slowly, the weight of the announcement settling over him. As he made his way to the podium, the crowd's cheers grew louder, a standing ovation erupting from every corner of the room. His steps felt surreal, as though he were moving through a dream. When he reached the podium, Councilwoman Harris shook his hand warmly, her smile radiating encouragement. "You've earned this," she said softly. Ethan turned to face the crowd, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and disbelief. The sea of faces before him blurred slightly as he blinked back tears. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the edges of the podium. "Thank you," he began, his voice wavering slightly but growing steadier with each word. "This is overwhelming. I never imagined that standing up for what I believe in would lead to something like this." The room grew quiet, hanging on his every word. "When I walked into this courthouse a few days ago, I felt like I didn't belong. I was dismissed before I even had a chance to speak. But what happened after that reminded me of something important. Our voices matter. Not just mine, but everyone's, especially the ones that are so often ignored." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "This role isn't just an opportunity for me. It's a responsibility to amplify those voices and to fight for a system that works for everyone, not just a privileged few. And I promise to lead with the same determination and hope that brought me here today." The applause was deafening. Ethan stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding with gratitude and resolve. As he returned to his seat, his mother pulled him into a tight embrace. Meanwhile, at the judge's table, Judge Hawthorne sat stiffly. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes followed Ethan with a mix of contemplation and something almost imperceptible, perhaps respect, or the beginnings of it. The ceremony concluded with more speeches and applause, but Ethan barely registered it. His mind was already racing with ideas, plans, and the immense responsibility that now lay before him. He wasn't just a contestant anymore. He was a symbol of change, a leader with the power to make a difference. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria leaned over and whispered, "You've started something big, Ethan. Don't stop now." Ethan smiled, his resolve hardening. "I won't, Mom. This is just the beginning." The room buzzed with the residual energy of applause, but Ethan Carter could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The spotlight, once so intimidating, now felt like a responsibility he could not ignore. As the newly announced Youth Justice Reform Director, the expectations were monumental, and the crowd awaited his next words with bated breath. Ethan stepped forward once again, this time not as a contestant, but as a leader. The podium felt less like an obstacle and more like a bridge between him and the people who had placed their faith in him. His mother's encouraging smile anchored him, while the faces in the crowd reminded him of the purpose that had brought him here. He took a steadying breath, scanning the room. "First, I want to thank you all for believing in me," he began, his voice laced with humility and gratitude. "This opportunity isn't something I take lightly. Standing here today, I'm reminded of the journey that brought me here and of the people who've been part of it." He paused, his gaze softening as he continued. "When I first walked into this courthouse, I didn't feel like I belonged. I was dismissed before I could even share my ideas. And for a moment, I doubted myself. But then, something incredible happened. This community reminded me that our voices matter, even when others try to silence them." The crowd was silent, hanging onto his every word. Ethan's voice grew stronger as he leaned into the raw emotion of his story. "My journey here isn't just my own. It's the story of every person who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or ignored by a system that's supposed to serve us all. It's the story of my friend Marcus, who didn't get the second chance he deserved. Of my uncle, who spent months behind bars simply because he couldn't afford bail. And of countless others whose names we'll never know, but whose struggles are no less real." His words struck a chord, rippling through the audience like a wave. A woman in the back dabbed at her eyes, and even some of the judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan pressed on, his voice filled with resolve. "Today, as I step into this role, I make a promise not just to this courthouse, but to the people it serves. I promise to work tirelessly to make our justice system fairer, more transparent, and more compassionate. I promise to listen to those who feel unheard and to fight for those who feel unseen. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles whitening as he channeled the passion burning inside him. Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But it starts with us with the courage to speak out, the determination to act, and the willingness to hold ourselves accountable. Together, we can build a system that doesn't just uphold the law, but upholds justice. The room erupted into applause, a thunderous show of support that left Ethan momentarily stunned. He stepped back from the podium, his chest rising and falling with the force of his emotions. The crowd's energy surged toward him like a tidal wave, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of their hope. As he returned to his seat, Maria stood and wrapped him in a tight embrace. "You were incredible," she whispered, her voice trembling with pride. "You said everything that needed to be said." Ethan smiled, his throat thick with emotion. "I just hope it's enough," he replied quietly. From the judge's table, Judge Robert Hawthorne watched the scene unfold. His sharp eyes, so often filled with scrutiny, now held a glimmer of something unexpected respect. Though his expression remained stoic, the slight nod he gave Ethan as their eyes met hinted at a shift, however small, in his perspective. As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached Ethan, shaking his hand and offering their congratulations. Among them was James Rivera, a local teacher and longtime advocate for youth empowerment. "You've got something special, Ethan," James said, his voice steady with conviction. "What you did today wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. People are going to look to you now. Are you ready for that?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I don't know if anyone's ever fully ready, but I know I'm willing. And I'm not doing this alone." James smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good answer. Let me know how I can help." As Ethan left the courthouse that evening, the sun setting behind him painted the city in hues of gold and orange. The world felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The boy who had been dismissed just days ago was now a young man armed with purpose, ready to take on the challenges ahead. The courthouse's marble halls felt quieter than usual in the weeks following Ethan Carter's speech, but the energy outside its walls was anything but subdued. Ethan's appointment as the Youth Justice Reform Director had ignited a spark in the community. It wasn't just about one young man anymore, it was about a movement. Ethan quickly discovered that his new role came with a steep learning curve. His days were consumed by meetings, planning sessions, and consultations with community leaders. Each morning, he arrived at the courthouse before sunrise, armed with notebooks full of ideas and a determination to make real change. One of his first initiatives was organizing a series of community listening sessions, where residents could share their experiences with the justice system. The first session, held in a modest community center, drew a crowd that far exceeded expectations. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds, single mothers, teenagers, retired veterans, all eager to have their voices heard. Ethan stood at the front of the room, a microphone in hand. His heart raced as he scanned the sea of faces, their collective hope and frustration pressing heavily on him. He cleared his throat, steadying himself. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "This isn't just about ideas, it's about action. And action starts with listening to the people who know the system best, you. So, please, speak freely. Your stories matter." The first speaker was a middle-aged woman named Gloria Hernandez, whose teenage son had been incarcerated for a minor infraction. Her voice wavered with emotion as she recounted the ordeal, the systemic hurdles her family had faced, and the lasting impact on her son. "It's not just the punishment," Gloria said, her hands trembling as she clutched the microphone. "It's the stigma that follows. My son served his time, but he can't escape what the system has labeled him. He's just a kid. He deserves a chance to rebuild his life." The room fell silent, Gloria's words hanging heavily in the air. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he nodded, his pen moving quickly across his notebook. Next came Marcus Taylor, a soft-spoken young man in his early 20s, who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Ethan. He hesitated before speaking, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I almost didn't come tonight," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But then I saw Ethan's speech online. It reminded me that we don't have to stay quiet. The system didn't give me much of a chance, but maybe this is a start." The applause that followed was deafening. Ethan's chest swelled with a mix of pride and responsibility. He realized that his role wasn't just to implement policies, it was to build trust, to make people believe that change was possible. In the weeks that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly to turn the stories he had heard into actionable plans. He collaborated with local activists, lawyers, and even sympathetic judges to draft proposals aimed at addressing systemic inequities. Among his key initiatives was the creation of a community justice liaison program designed to provide support and advocacy for individuals navigating the legal system. "People don't fail the system," Ethan said during a press conference announcing the program. "The system fails the people. This program is about changing that, about making justice accessible, equitable, and fair for everyone." The program quickly gained traction. Volunteers from the community stepped forward to serve as liaisons, offering their time and expertise to help those in need. Ethan made sure the program wasn't just symbolic, but deeply impactful, ensuring that every liaison received proper training and resources. One day, as Ethan reviewed the program's progress in his office, Maria stopped by with a lunch she had prepared. She placed the brown bag on his desk and smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You're really doing it," she said softly, her voice tinged with awe. "All those nights we spent talking about what could be, now it's real." Ethan looked up at her, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "It's only the beginning, Mom. There's still so much to do." Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "Just remember, you don't have to do it all at once. Change takes time, but you've already done more than most people dream of." Ethan's efforts didn't go unnoticed. Media outlets began covering the progress of the reform initiatives, and support poured in from neighboring communities. Students at local schools wrote letters of appreciation, activists offered their expertise, and even some critics began to acknowledge the potential of Ethan's work. Meanwhile, Judge Robert Hawthorne found himself watching from the sidelines. Though he hadn't openly supported Ethan's appointment, he couldn't deny the impact the young man was having. One afternoon, while reviewing a case, he glanced at an article highlighting the success of the Community Justice Liaison Program. A rare smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe the boy has something after all," he muttered under his breath. The brisk morning air carried a sense of renewal as Ethan Carter stood outside the courthouse, staring at the steps that had once felt so daunting. Now they felt different, like a threshold to something greater. Behind him, the sounds of a bustling city filled the air, but Ethan's focus was on the day ahead. Today marked 6 months since he had been appointed as the Youth Justice Reform Director, and while the challenges had been many, the victories had been far greater. The courthouse lobby was already buzzing with activity when he entered. A team of volunteers greeted him warmly, their energy infectious. Among them was Gloria Hernandez, the mother who had once shared her heartbreaking story at one of Ethan's first community listening sessions. Today, she was a key member of the Community Justice Liaison Program, using her experiences to guide others. "Ethan," Gloria called out, her smile wide and genuine. "You ready for the big meeting?" He nodded, his own smile reflecting her enthusiasm. "As ready as I'll ever be. Thanks for everything you've done to make this happen." "It's you who made it happen," Gloria replied, her voice brimming with gratitude. "You gave us hope when we didn't think we had any left." The conference room was filled with community leaders, court officials, and activists, all gathered to review the progress of Ethan's initiatives. Large charts displayed statistics showing reduced case backlogs, improved bail conditions, and increased community trust in the legal system. Ethan stood at the head of the table, his confidence radiating as he began his presentation. 6 months ago, we set out to address some of the most pressing issues in our justice system, Ethan began, his voice clear and steady. Today, I'm proud to share that we've made measurable progress. But this isn't just about numbers, it's about people. It's about giving families like Gloria's a chance to rebuild, about creating a system that serves everyone fairly. As he spoke, the room was silent, every eye fixed on him. Even Judge Robert Hawthorne, seated near the back, seemed engaged. Over the months, Ethan had noticed a subtle shift in the judge's demeanor. Hawthorne had become less dismissive, more willing to listen. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. When Ethan concluded his presentation, the room erupted in applause. Councilwoman Angela Harris, who had championed Ethan from the beginning, stood to address the group. "Ethan," she said, her tone filled with pride, "your leadership has shown us all what's possible when we put people first. You've reminded us that change doesn't come from the top down, it comes from brave individuals who dare to challenge the status quo. Thank you." Ethan's chest swelled with emotion as he accepted the praise. But he knew this wasn't just his victory, it belonged to everyone who had fought alongside him. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone on a park bench, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The weight of the day's accomplishments and the journey that had brought him here filled his mind. He thought about his mother, whose unwavering belief in him had been his anchor. He thought about Marcus, whose story had inspired his first steps toward justice. And he thought about Judge Hawthorne, whose initial dismissal had sparked the fire that carried him this far. As if summoned by his thoughts, footsteps approached. Ethan looked up to see Judge Hawthorne standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his overcoat. "Mind if I sit?" the judge asked, his voice softer than usual. Ethan nodded, surprised but curious. The older man lowered himself onto the bench, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've done well, Carter," Hawthorne said after a long pause. "I didn't think much of you when we first met. I suppose I was wrong." The admission caught Ethan off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "Thank you, Judge," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "That means a lot." Hawthorne nodded, his expression contemplative. "You've shown me that maybe the system isn't as rigid as I thought. Maybe it can change if we're willing to change with it." Ethan smiled, a sense of closure settling over him. It's never too late to start. The following week, Ethan stood on the steps of the courthouse once again, this time flanked by his team of community leaders and volunteers. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment as he announced the expansion of the Community Justice Liaison Program to neighboring districts. His voice rang out with conviction, his words a rallying cry for continued reform. Today is proof that when we come together, we can build something better. This is just the beginning. There's more work to be done, but together, we'll make justice a reality for everyone. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy fueling Ethan's determination. He looked out at the sea of faces, each one a reminder of why he had started this journey. In that moment, he knew that the boy who had once been dismissed and underestimated had become a leader, a symbol of hope, and a catalyst for change.